The Man Who Returned to Dust. The first time Caleb Monroe saw the Mustang, it wasn't galloping across the plains like in the stories his father used to tell. It stood utterly still at the edge of the tree line, a dark figure etched against the pale Montana sky, its mane tangled by the wind, eyes locked on him with an intensity that felt almost unnatural. The ranch had been silent all day, the kind of silence that made a man feel like an intruder in his own home. But this silence was different, watchful, loaded. The air didn't just feel cold, it felt warned. Caleb had spent most of the afternoon working alone near the western fence line. He'd been patching a section that had collapsed under years of rot and neglect, swinging a hammer without much care for precision. After all, the place wasn't what it used to be. The Monroe Ranch, once the pride of Wildridge and his father's entire legacy, had fallen into disrepair while Caleb was overseas. Jack Monroe had been a quiet man, never one for long conversations or visible tenderness, but he had cared for this land and its horses with a stubborn devotion that Caleb only began to understand after he was gone. That understanding didn't bring peace, not when guilt clung to Caleb like a second skin. He hadn't made it back in time for the funeral. He hadn't even seen his father's body. Just a closed casket, a folded flag, and a house thick with dust and memories that wouldn't settle. Caleb had come back from war not to start a new life, but to shoulder what was left of an old one. So when the Mustang appeared, silent and unmoving, something shifted in Caleb's chest. It wasn't fear exactly, though his breath did catch and his grip tightened on the fence rail. It was recognition, like the horse had stepped out of some half-formed dream. He dropped the hammer, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, eyes never leaving the creature. The Mustang didn't move. Its coat was rough, mottled with dirt and burrs, but underneath the grime, the muscle tone was undeniable. This was no lost colt. It carried age and experience in every line of its body. Caleb noticed the limp, subtle but present in the way it shifted its weight. An old wound, maybe, the kind that either breaks a creature or reshapes it. And its eyes, God, those eyes, were too calm to belong to something feral. There was calculation there. Judgment, maybe. He stepped forward once, slow and quiet, boots crunching the dry weeds beneath his feet. The horse flicked its ears but didn't bolt. Caleb knew wild behavior. He'd seen it in animals, in men. The way the Mustang held its ground wasn't defiance. It was a kind of invitation. He took another step, heart hammering in his chest without a clear reason why. Something about this encounter felt larger than it was, like he was brushing up against the edge of a story not yet told. Then, as if deciding the moment had lasted long enough, the horse snorted sharply, turned, and disappeared into the pines. Without a word, without even thinking, Caleb unlatched the makeshift gate and followed. The forest swallowed sound like water swallows flame. Tall pine trees closed in on either side, their branches whispering to one another far overhead. The trail was barely a memory, lost under layers of pine needles and creeping moss. Caleb moved carefully, scanning for movement, listening for hoofbeats, though none came. The sun had started its descent, casting long bars of gold and shadow through the canopy. For a moment, he questioned his own sanity, chasing a ghost into the woods, guided only by instinct and the echo of something unspoken. Then he saw it. Just ahead, in a clearing he didn't remember from his childhood, stood a cabin. Weathered, leaning slightly as though time itself had tried to erase it but lacked the strength. Caleb felt something sink inside him, a heaviness not born from fatigue. The cabin wasn't part of the Monroe property. He would have remembered. It looked older than the house he grew up in, older than the fence posts his grandfather used to mend. The Mustang stood to the side of the clearing, head lowered, as if granting him the right to approach alone. Caleb took a few steps forward, flashlight now in hand, though daylight still clung stubbornly to the treetops. The door was shut, not locked, but not wide open either. Windows were boarded over. The structure sagged with decay. He stepped onto the porch, and the boards groaned beneath his weight. He didn't call out. Something told him not to. Instead, he pressed his palm against the door, hesitated, and pushed it open. The smell hit him first, damp, mold, and something else. Something sharp and metallic. The inside was dim and motionless. Dust hung in the air like ash. A single broken chair lay on its side near the fireplace, and against the far wall, curled like a child hiding from the dark, was a figure. Caleb's breath caught. It was a woman. He crossed the floor in seconds, heart thundering, dropping to his knees beside her. She was unconscious, her skin pale and clammy. Her lips were cracked. A bruise bloomed across her temple. Her clothes were dirty, torn in places, but it was the stillness of her chest that chilled him. He pressed fingers to her neck. A pulse, faint but present. He fumbled for his phone, found a signal, and called for help. He gave the coordinates from memory, a skill drilled into him by years of combat zones. Then he leaned closer to the woman, lifting her head gently, whispering reassurances he wasn't sure she could hear. Outside, the Mustang let out a low, rumbling snort. When the rescue team arrived, 2 medics and a local deputy, the light was nearly gone. Caleb had lit a small fire outside to guide them, his coat wrapped around the woman's shoulders. Solace, as he had started to think of the horse, remained still, watching from a distance, but never leaving. The woman's name, they would learn later, was Charlotte Wynne. And though no one could yet explain how she ended up there, or why Solace had led Caleb to that exact spot, one thing was suddenly, undeniably clear. This wasn't just about a lost horse or a grieving soldier. Something deeper had called them both to that forgotten trail in the woods, and something darker still might be waiting beyond it. The forgotten cabin. The forest closed in tighter with each passing step, its silence thick and pressing, broken only by the steady crunch of Caleb's boots and the occasional rustle of wind through the pine boughs. The trail, if it could even be called that, had long since vanished beneath decades of fallen needles and moss. Yet Solace pressed forward with quiet purpose, his breath clouding the fading light in rhythmic bursts. Caleb followed, heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and unease, one hand resting near the old flashlight clipped to his jacket, the other brushing aside low branches that clawed at his sleeves. The world around him dimmed as they moved deeper into the hollow where even birds dared not sing. Suddenly, Solace stopped. The Mustang's ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring as he let out a low, uncertain snort. Caleb narrowed his eyes and stepped around him, the faint outline of a building emerging through the trees. It wasn't large, barely more than a cabin, but it was real. The structure slumped like a man long defeated, its roof sagging under the weight of time, windows boarded haphazardly, and the door hanging slightly ajar. A sign above the entrance, cracked and weather-beaten, bore the faded imprint of a name Caleb didn't recognize. Whitner's something. The last few letters had long since peeled away. He approached slowly, every nerve in his body alert. The air around the place was wrong, thick with a sour scent that made the back of his throat tighten. Solace stopped short of the porch, pawing once at the ground and letting out a low, mournful cry. Caleb hesitated, the hairs on the back of his neck rising as he placed a boot on the first step. It groaned under his weight. He pressed his shoulder to the door, expecting it to creak open, but it wouldn't budge. locked or jammed. Frowning, he backed up and scanned the side of the cabin, spotting a broken window just big enough to slip through. He didn't question the risk. Something deeper than logic urged him forward. It was cold inside, damp and still. Dust hung in the air like old breath. The flashlight flickered across overturned furniture, shattered picture frames, a lamp long burned out. Caleb moved carefully through the room, the floor soft and unsteady beneath his boots. It wasn't until he reached the far corner that he saw the crumpled figure, half hidden beneath an old tarp, like a forgotten sack of cloth. His breath caught as he knelt, reaching out to pull the tarp aside. Beneath it was a woman, young, pale, her face flushed with fever and ringed with grime. Her clothes were torn, her shoes mismatched, and her wrists bore faint bruises, old enough to hint at captivity, recent enough to sting his conscience. Caleb cursed under his breath and checked for a pulse. It was weak but steady. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven rhythm. He fumbled for his phone, praying for signal, and got one blinking bar, enough to call for help. While he waited for dispatch to respond, he fetched the emergency blanket from his pack, wrapping it gently around her frame. Her lips moved slightly, forming a soundless shape that might have been a word. He leaned closer, catching a broken whisper. "Don't let him find me." The air shifted around him. Caleb straightened slowly, his back tensing as he reached for the flashlight again and scanned the room. There was no one else there, but something about her words chilled him more than the cold. He moved to the window and called out to Solace, who stood frozen at the tree line, his ears sharp and his stance rigid. Caleb had seen animals react to fear before. This wasn't that. This was recognition. The Mustang let out a low, trembling whinny, and then turned his gaze to the deeper woods beyond. When the rescue crew arrived, a pair of paramedics and one deputy, they worked quickly, efficiently. Caleb watched from the porch, arms folded, his jaw tight as they carried the unconscious woman out on a stretcher. She moaned faintly when the cold air hit her skin, but her eyes didn't open. The deputy, a wiry man with a worn badge reading Hawkins, asked Caleb a series of clipped questions. How did he find her? Did he know her name? She said something about someone chasing her, Caleb murmured, eyes locked on the woods. And the name Whitmore. Said it like a warning. Deputy Hawkins frowned and jotted something in a weathered notebook. The paramedics loaded her into the back of the ambulance. As it pulled away, Caleb felt the first edge of a question begin to form, a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Why this cabin? Why now? And how had Solace known? Later that night, back at the ranch, Caleb sat on the steps of the porch, watching Solace pace the fence line like a restless sentry. The sky was dark and thick with clouds, and the wind whispered through the grass like old secrets. He lit a fire in the pit and stared into the flames, his thoughts circling like vultures. That girl, Charlotte, as the paramedics later told him, wasn't just running from something. She was running from someone. And whoever it was, they might not be far behind. Solace came to a stop beside him, his breath steaming in the cold. Caleb reached out and brushed a hand along his mane. The Mustang didn't flinch. Instead, he nudged Caleb's shoulder with a surprising tenderness, then turned suddenly, his body tensing as his ears swiveled toward the road. There, beyond the gate, a figure watched from the tree line, too far to see clearly, too still to be wildlife. Caleb rose slowly, the firelight flickering against the unease rising in his chest. Solace let out a low whinny, stepping protectively between Caleb and the dark. Whatever storm had started with the return of a soldier and the arrival of a wild Mustang was far from over. And in the shadows of Wildridge, silence was never just silence. It was the sound of something waiting. The keeper of secrets. The ranch stirred to life beneath a pale morning fog, the kind that curled over the paddocks and wrapped itself around fence posts like smoke from an unseen fire. Caleb stood at the edge of the barn, one boot perched on the lowest rail, watching Solace pace the perimeter with deliberate, tireless steps. The Mustang moved like a whisper on the land, his movements both patient and sharp, a sentinel who understood the boundaries better than any man. Since the night at the cabin, Solace hadn't strayed far from the house, and something in Caleb told him the Mustang had no plans to leave. Not yet. Something still lingered in the air, a weight that hadn't lifted even after the girl had been taken safely to the hospital. Inside the house, Caleb poured coffee into a chipped mug, the old kitchen humming quietly with the sound of wind outside. He hadn't slept much. His thoughts had kept him up. Thoughts of Charlotte, of the name Whitmore, spoken in a hushed rasp, of the distant figure in the woods, too still to be harmless. He didn't speak of it to anyone, not even the deputy who called to follow up, just said he'd heard nothing more and left it at that. But the unease gnawed at him. By afternoon, he found himself driving back toward the woods with a flashlight, rope, and an uneasy determination. Solace followed behind, as if already knowing the way. The cabin came into view through the thinning trees, unchanged but heavier somehow, as though it had absorbed the fear Charlotte had left behind. The door still hung crooked from when he'd forced it open. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and rot. He moved cautiously, flashlight beams skimming over scattered furniture and debris. It was in the side room, where he had found Charlotte unconscious, that he noticed something odd. The low ceiling sagged unevenly, and near one wall the plaster had cracked away, revealing the faint outline of an attic hatch. With effort, he dragged a broken chair under it and climbed, prying open the panel with the butt of his flashlight. The space above was cramped and smelled of old wood and insulation. He pulled himself up and swept the light slowly around. There, shoved into the corner, was a wooden box wrapped in a tattered blanket. Inside, he found a stack of yellowed envelopes bound with twine, each addressed in careful cursive. "To my family, from Thomas Whitmore." Beneath them, a small water-stained journal sat wedged beneath a folded shirt. Caleb thumbed through it, the writing jagged and dense, rambling at times but unmistakably haunted. The words weren't just notes, they were confessions, of exile, of bitterness, of something lost between generations. One line stood out. "I was never meant to leave, but silence was safer than war." The floor creaked beneath him, loud enough to startle. Caleb stiffened, flashlight jerking toward the hatch, but saw nothing. Still, something about the silence pressed harder now, like the cabin was holding its breath. He lowered the box, descending slowly and tucking the contents under his coat. But as he stepped into the main room, the floor gave way. His foot plunged through rotted wood, sending him tumbling forward with a grunt. The journal flew from his grip. Pain shot up his leg as he tried to pull himself out of the hole, one arm bracing against a splintered beam. Then came the noise, quiet, deliberate. A creak on the porch outside, followed by a low snort. "Solace," Caleb called, breathless. A sharp whinny answered, followed by a loud slam. Someone, was testing the porch boards. He scrambled upright, dragging the box with him, his flashlight beam flickering across the window. A figure stood just beyond the glass, partially obscured, unmoving. Caleb backed toward the door, every muscle in his body screaming to run. Then came the sound of hoofbeats, fast and unrelenting. Solace. The Mustang charged into view, hooves striking the porch, head low, tail whipping like a banner in wind. The figure disappeared into the trees. Outside, Caleb stumbled into the cold air, chest heaving. Solace trotted in circles before him, agitated but steady, his breath rising like smoke. Caleb rested a hand on the horse's neck, his heart still racing. That night, back at the ranch, he lit the fireplace and spread the journal pages across the floor, reading by the flickering light. The letters told a story he didn't yet fully understand. A family torn by pride and silence. A man exiled not by violence but by truth too heavy to bear. Charlotte's father. Maybe the cabin had never been just a place to hide. Maybe it had been a prison, built by regret. Solace stood at the back door, head low, eyes on the dark beyond the yard. Caleb sat beside the fire, watching the flames dance over old words. He didn't know yet what to do with what he'd found, but the one thing he knew for certain was this. Whatever had begun with Charlotte in that cabin wasn't over, and the Mustang, with his steady gaze and battle-worn grace, wasn't just a guide anymore, he was a guardian. When the wind changed. The storm came before sunrise. A bitter wind screamed down from the Bitterroot Mountains, stripping loose shingles from the barn roof and sending the old weather vane into a frenzied spin. Caleb woke not to the sound of wind, but to the piercing, urgent cry of Solace. The Mustang's hooves drummed hard across the frozen ground outside, and through the frost-glazed window Caleb could see his silhouette in the half-light, tense, circling, alert. That wasn't fear, that was warning. By the time Caleb had shoved his boots on and stepped out into the cold, Solace had stopped pacing and stood like a statue, head turned toward the western tree line. The air smelled of something more than winter, something electric. Caleb's eyes followed Solace's gaze, and he caught a flash of movement. Too large for a fox, too slow for a deer. The shadow vanished behind the trees, leaving behind a ripple in the stillness. Caleb's heart tightened. Inside the house, Charlotte stood in the kitchen, pale and silent, holding her coffee mug with both hands. She had returned 3 days earlier, bruises still blooming on her skin and determination etched into every line of her face. Her release from the hospital had come early, a decision made not by doctors, but by her own unshakable resolve. Since then, she had barely spoken about what happened. Instead, she buried herself in a notepad, sketching floor plans and scribbling notes with a kind of quiet desperation. She had named the place Whitner's Haven, a cabin that had nearly been her grave, and she was determined to transform it into something sacred. Caleb didn't question it. He simply moved with her. "Someone's out there," he said, setting the rifle on the counter, the words flat and heavy in the charged air. "Could be the man who locked you in." Charlotte didn't flinch. She only nodded, eyes sharp. "Then let's end it." By late morning, they were heading back into the forest. The wind clawed through the trees, but it had eased from its earlier rage. Solace walked behind them, unhaltered, quiet but visibly alert, his ears swiveling with every creak of the woods. Caleb led the way, flashlight in one hand, the brittle, leather-bound journal of his father tucked under his arm. They said little on the way, words no longer necessary. The path was familiar now. The cabin emerged from the trees like a relic of a forgotten era, its porch sagging, windows boarded, the air around it heavy with stories. Inside, the cold had settled deep into the walls. The must of rot lingered beneath the surface of dust and mildew. Charlotte moved through the space slowly, touching the walls, her steps deliberate. This time, she didn't shrink from the place. She confronted it. Caleb led her to the attic crawlspace and handed her the box of letters. She read through the faded handwriting, her father's voice returning in fragments, each page a piece of a life she never knew. He hadn't abandoned her. He had been silenced by those who feared the truth. The name Monroe was repeated, her father had known Caleb's, and not as strangers. Their families were connected through old blood and older wounds. In the glow of a flashlight, Charlotte found a hidden drawer in the hearth, its seams barely visible. Inside was a rusted tin box. She opened it with shaking hands and discovered letters addressed to her. Some were sealed, some were open, the ink smudged from time and tears. They were never mailed. Her father had written to her, tried to reach her from the shadows he was buried in. Outside, Solace snorted and pawed at the frost-covered ground. Caleb rose, moving to the porch just in time to see a black truck inching down the trail. Its lights off, engine purring low like a predator's growl. He stepped forward, rifle slung but ready, his pulse steady despite the storm rising in his chest. Charlotte joined him, her hand gripping the doorframe. The truck stopped 10 feet from the porch. A man stepped out slowly. He wore a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but Charlotte's breath caught the moment she saw him. "It's him," she said, barely a whisper. "He locked me in." Caleb didn't wait. "You're on private land. Get back in your truck and go." The man didn't answer. His hand hovered near his hip. Then the air cracked as Solace charged from the side yard like a fury made flesh. He moved with a wild grace, a blend of power and precision, placing himself directly between the man and the porch. His ears pinned flat, hooves cutting divots into the frozen dirt, and his eyes locked on the intruder with burning clarity. The man stepped back, startled. The tension snapped. The stranger muttered a curse and slowly backed away, his boots crunching on the gravel. He opened the truck door, hesitated once more, then drove off, tires skidding as he vanished down the road. Solace stood frozen until the rumble faded into silence. Then he turned his head toward Caleb and Charlotte. The danger passed, his duty fulfilled. They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in the quiet. Caleb lowered the rifle. Charlotte exhaled shakily. The cold seemed less biting now. That evening, they returned to the ranch with the letters. Charlotte sat by the fire, the tin box in her lap. She read for hours, her lips moving soundlessly over her father's words. Caleb didn't ask questions. He mended a broken stair tread in the hallway, the hammer's rhythm a kind of lullaby. When he passed her, he placed a fresh cup of coffee beside her, and she reached out, brushing her fingers against his for just a second. That was all either of them needed. Outside, the wind had finally died. The snow had stopped. Solace stood under the porch awning, his breath rising in gentle puffs, ears twitching as if listening to something neither human could hear. He had not run. He had not wandered. He had chosen to stay. And Caleb, who had spent years wandering deserts and war zones, who had returned to a home that felt like a tomb, now understood something he hadn't before. Solace had not merely found him. He had led him here, through silence, through danger, through pain, to this truth, this woman, and this chance to begin again. For the first time in his memory, the storm had passed, and he no longer felt the cold in his bones. He felt the warmth of something returning. A life, a future, a place to belong. Perfect. Now let's bring this story full circle, where we choose to stay. The morning after the storm broke clear and breathless, the kind of morning that made Wildridge feel untouched by time. The frost sparkled like tiny mirrors across the grass. The mountains stretched pale blue beneath a silver sky, and for once the world did not feel heavy. It simply waited. Caleb stepped onto the porch with a mug in hand, steam curling against the cold air. Below the railing, Solace stood quietly near the fence, ears pricked as if listening for something distant. The Mustang hadn't wandered since the confrontation at the cabin. He lingered like a sentinel, like he belonged now, not as property, but as a keeper of something sacred. Caleb had stopped trying to make sense of it. Some truths didn't need logic to be real. Inside the house, Charlotte moved slowly through the kitchen, the tin box of letters clutched close to her chest. Her eyes were tired, rimmed red from reading through the night, but there was something in her face that hadn't been there before. Peace. It wasn't triumph, and it wasn't quite joy, but it was solid. A calm earned through fire and wreckage. She had spent the early hours copying lines into a leather journal of her own, her handwriting looping gently beside her father's. It wasn't a clean reconciliation. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave shape to the silence. Later that morning, they returned to the cabin with tools in the truck bed and sawdust on their clothes. They worked in tandem, measuring, sawing, clearing out debris with a rhythm born not of urgency, but of purpose. It wasn't about restoration anymore. It was about reclaiming space, rewriting the purpose of this place from grief into belonging. At noon, they hoisted a new wooden plaque over the door. Charlotte had carved the words herself with Caleb's pocket knife the night before. Whitner's Haven, where memories come home. By mid-afternoon, word had gotten out. Small-town gossip was more efficient than radio waves. A handful of townspeople began arriving in quiet trickles. Curious neighbors, retired ranchers, a local pastor. Clara from the diner brought lemon scones and a thermos of black coffee. Even Deputy Reed, who had first responded the night Caleb called for help, stopped by with his daughter, who clutched a hand-drawn picture of the magic horse. The girl handed it shyly to Charlotte, who pinned it to the newly sanded cabin wall without a word. Children gathered near the fence when they saw Solace. Some whispered that he was a spirit horse, sent from the mountains. Others swore he had wings, even if you couldn't see them. Caleb just stood back and watched, one boot resting on the porch step, arms crossed, letting the moment unfold. He didn't correct them. Solace didn't need explaining. As the sun began to dip, turning the snow golden copper, Charlotte stepped onto the porch with the last letter in hand. Her voice wavered only slightly as she began to read. "It was never my wish to disappear," she said, fingers tightening on the paper. "But sometimes silence feels safer than the truth. I left things unsaid because I didn't know how to say them. I wish now that I had tried." She paused, swallowed hard, and then lifted her chin. "To whoever finds this, know that I loved my family, even when I didn't know how to show it. Know that I was trying, in my own broken way, to come back." By the time she folded the letter again, the small crowd had fallen into a hush deeper than reverence. It was the hush of understanding. That night, only Caleb, Charlotte, and Solace remained. The others drifted home, leaving behind footprints in the snow and something softer in the air. Blessing, maybe. Acceptance. They sat around a small fire ring behind the cabin, bundled in coats, hands wrapped around tin mugs filled with coffee gone cold. Solace grazed a few yards away, flicking his tail at the quiet wind. The stars came out slow and deliberate, winking one by one into the dark sky. "You think this place will last?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked toward the cabin, its roof patched, its windows glowing faint amber from the lantern inside. "If it doesn't, we'll rebuild it again," he said finally. "That's what we do now." She smiled, faint but full. "And if the past comes back again?" He looked at her, not past her, not through her, at her. "Then we don't run from it, we stay." She nodded once, and that was enough. Sometime past midnight, when the fire had settled into glowing coals and the temperature dipped into the bones, they rose and made their way back to the house. Solace followed, silent as a shadow. As they reached the porch, the Mustang paused at the steps, ears flicking toward the tree line. Caleb turned and met his gaze. No ropes, no bridle, no fences strong enough to hold him. Yet the horse remained. "Thank you," Caleb said softly, hand resting against the Mustang's broad neck. "For staying, for leading us home." Solace exhaled, his breath warm and steady in the dark, and walked a slow circle around them before settling near the porch post, tail curled, head low. Charlotte leaned her head against Caleb's shoulder as they watched him. "Do you think he'll ever leave?" she asked. Caleb tilted his head. "Maybe, but even if he does, he'll find his way back. He always does." And in that quiet, beneath the Montana sky thick with stars, with the cabin reborn behind them and the weight of unspoken grief finally eased, they stood as three souls who had chosen, again and again, not to run, but to stay. Because where the silence led them was home.